anatomists and physiologists. This video is another video about our blood vessels. This is part 3, talking more about circulation physiology. We already talked about what happens at the capillary level with things like diffusion and with bulk flow, but now we'll talk a little bit more broadly about circulation in general. Okay, let's get started. First things first is I think there's some new words that we need to talk about. So the first of those words, I'll highlight it for you, is blood flow. Blood flow is just the volume of blood flowing through a thing, through a vessel, through an organ, through whatever, in a minute. So the volume of blood flowing through a vessel or an organ or something in a minute. And we know that if we were to look at the whole of the body, all of the blood, that would actually be cardiac output, because cardiac output is how much blood is pumped per minute. But if we think about all of the blood flow at once, flow for all of the blood would be cardiac output. So that's kind of nice. We kind of know a little bit about this already. The next new word that we're learning is blood pressure. Blood pressure is like if I were to draw a vessel, like a blood vessel. So there's my blood vessel. Blood pressure is the pressure that fluid pushes on those walls. And it's usually so it's the force, that's like the pressure that blood pushes on vessel walls. And we typically report this in the unit millimeters of mercury. That's just the unit. Anytime you see millimeters of mercury, mmHg, always think, well, okay, that's blood pressure or some kind of pressure going on. And then the last new word is resistance. Resistance is sometimes abbreviated to R or to TPR. TPR is, so we sometimes call resistance total peripheral resistance. And we call it that because resistance is really just the opposition to blood flow. So how easily blood is flowing through the vessel. So resistance is just how easily blood flows through vessel. And we know that if things get hard, like resistance increases, there's a couple of factors there, because friction increases and these kinds of things. But there's some factors that make resistance more or less of a thing that we have to worry about. One of them is blood viscosity. I'll highlight all these factors in pink. So blood viscosity is like how thick or how thin the blood is. So if we say something is viscous or something has a high viscosity, it's something like close to honey. Like honey is very viscous opposed to water, less viscous. So if there is more thickness, more viscosity, we'd say that there's more stuff in the blood. And so if viscosity goes up, then that raises resistance. Usually blood viscosity is pretty much the same. So it's not a factor that we care about as much on a day-to-day basis, but it can change, so that's something to think about. The next one that we'll talk about is length, how long that vessel is. The longer, so increasing length, that leads to more TPR, more resistance. And growing our vessels happens as we grow. As we grow up, we increase the length of our vessel. So TPR would increase as we grow. Okay, and then lastly is diameter. Diameter is how big or how small that lumen of the blood vessel is. So if we increase our diameter of our blood vessel, then we would have less TPR. That would be in cases of like vasodilation, for example. If we decrease our diameter, then that would lead to more TPR, more resistance. But it's not always that simple, right? Because if we increase or decrease blood vessel diameter, yeah, sure, that will have an effect on TPR. But also, if there are things in the blood vessel that we don't want, like plaques, buildup, that kind of thing, that causes something called turbulent flow. So while the diameter of that blood vessel is shrinking, it's also the flow of blood is also getting turbulent. So it's not as smooth because it's running into stuff. It's not supposed to run into that stuff. And that also increases resistance. So turbulent flow, maybe due to like plaques in the vessel, that also increases resistance. Alrighty. So now that we've gone over these terms, how are all of those terms related? How are flow, blood pressure, TPR, how are those guys related? And so we can write this as like a mathematical relationship, and we do not do math in this class, but we can think about this equation in terms of relationships. So flow, blood flow, is the same or is equal to that pressure differential, like how much that pressure changes over TPR. So what this tells us is that if pressure goes up, so does flow. If TPR goes up, then that means flow goes down, which if we think about it, it makes sense. Like if there's more pressure, of course there's more flow because there's more pressure pushing it to flow more. And then if there's more resistance, well, yeah, there'd be less flow because there's more resistance to the flow. Okay, so these are things that we just care about. And we care about these relationships because they'll keep coming back. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about blood pressure. And when we talk about blood pressure, most days we talk about arterial blood pressure. In arterial blood pressure, again, the pressure pushing against the vessel wall depends on two major factors here, like how much your elastic arteries are stretchy. Are they distanced? Are they in compliance? So there's all of these things that how are elastic arteries working? And then the other thing is that how much volume of blood is there at any one time? If there's more volume, then we would expect more pressure because it's more stuff to push on the walls of that vessel. And we usually report um, our arterial blood pressures in terms of a fraction. It's usually reported as like systolic pressure over diastolic. That systolic pressure refers to ventricular contraction. So, oops, I spelled diastolic wrong. Let me fix it. Anyways, systolic pressure refers to the pressure that blood is flowing at and pushing on those vessel walls um, when the ventricles contract because ventricular systole pushes blood out and puts more pressure on those arteries. Diastolic pressure, typically the lower number, and it's reported there on the bottom, is the pressure that blood is pushing on the atrial wall or arterial walls during diastole. So when those ventricles are relaxed, what is that pressure? And typically our average-ish is about 120 over 80. And this is reported in millimeters of mercury millimeters of mercury, because again, that is that pressure unit we keep talking about. Because arterial blood pressure differs from ventricular systole to ventricular diastole, oftentimes we find it important to talk about the average arterial pressure, mean arterial pressure. So what's like the average pressure in the arteries at any one time? This is a math equation that we don't really care to calculate, but it does include the diastolic pressure, and it also includes the pulse pressure. That's another new word, so I'm going to highlight it. The pulse pressure is that difference between your systolic pressure, your diastolic pressure. And that's kind of the thing that you feel if you were to palpate your pulse pressure. And the average-ish, the mean arterial pressure, or we call it MAP, it's the pressure that makes sure that blood is going to all of our tissues. We need MAP to be maintained at all times because that's what makes sure that all of our tissues get enough blood. And of course, this includes math, but we don't calculate this math. We care about the trends. If MAP goes up, if MAP goes down, and what causes MAP to go up and what causes MAP to go down. And we have a lot of things to talk about when it comes to that. But a trend to know is that the farther away from the heart that we get, so MAP, it's supposed to be capital A, MAP decreases as we get farther away from the heart. Which we know already, we've already chatted about this, that pressure goes down the farther away from being an artery that we are. So MAP will decrease, 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 and then, well, that's a whole other lecture that we'll talk about. And pulse pressure, especially, pulse pressure goes away over time, and it goes away over distance. So in a vein, for example, on the tail end of that systemic circulation, for example, we don't really have a pulse pressure. It kind of goes away. All right. So speaking of pulses, we can palpate or feel a pulse in a bunch of different areas of the body. So these little red dots are trying to show you, and this is figure 19.8 from your text, where are those common points of where that pulse can be palpated. And palpated in anatomy and physiology land, palpate, I think of that like to feel. So to feel, like with your two fingers usually. Okay, so speaking of pressures, back to pressure. So we're looking at a graph here, but I don't really care. Like there's some numbers here because we're talking about pressure there on the y-axis. Remember the pressure unit, millimeters of mercury. We're not going to get scared. It's just a pressure unit. So there's numbers there, and so pressure's going up. That's fine. But what I really want to draw your attention to down is on the x-axis. There's all these different vessels. The aorta, arteries in general, and then arteries get smaller into arterioles, capillaries, venules, little veins, and then lastly, the biggest veins, the vena cavas, or the vena cavae. We call them the vena cavas because I like that word better. So what we're looking at here is a trend. The trend is that blood pressure, this is blood pressure on the Y, goes down the farther away from being an artery that we are. The farther away from being an artery that we are, the blood pressure is going down. The other thing to notice is that when you're in like this pink land, which is all of your aorta, your arteries, your arterioles, that kind of thing, there's a pressure differential. We have the systolic pressure and we have the diastolic pressure at the bottom. And then this line there in the middle is like the average. That's the MAP. Okay, so the mean pressure, I'll label this, also known as MAP. Okay. Um, and so that difference goes away by the time that we're a capillary. Once we cross that line into capillary, there's really not a systolic pressure or diastolic pressure anymore because capillaries are really, really teeny tiny vessels and they can't really withstand all of that pressure anyways. So it's kind of a good thing. Okay, so let's chat a little bit then about arteries, arterioles. We're going to write all over this graph. So back to blood pressure. Blood pressure, remember, is just the pressure that pushes against the vessel walls. What we're looking at on this graph, we can see generally that arteries have a higher blood pressure compared to all the other vessels. That's really important because arteries have a lot of pressure, but then they need to supply blood to all of the body because they branch and they branch. And the aorta has a ton of branches, and arteries branch off more, and then arterioles branch off even more, and then finally they're capillaries. And then capillaries, they combine into venules, and you know the rest of the story. But arteries, their whole thing is branching out. So they need that pressure to be able to do all of that. The thing about capillaries is that capillaries, so um, this whole section here is capillaries. So that's kind of where I'm going to write all my notes about capillaries. So capillaries are really permeable. But to promote things crossing borders, it's helpful to have a little bit of pressure, but not too much. They're really delicate vessels. So they're also delicate. So we want to be careful with them. So it's really good that we're not going out the gate at like 120 millimeters of mercury in a capillary. That's really important. This is a really big drop off in capillaries. In venules and veins in the vena cava, yeah, there's even more. Because veins have so much less pressure, that's fine because we have no pulse pressure. So no pulse pressure in capillaries, and then no pulse pressure in veins. So all this whole box is where I'm going to write my stuff about veins. So no pulse pressure. Because we have less pressure, we need help getting that blood back to the heart. And there's three mechanisms through which this works. Okay, so one of those mechanisms to help blood get back to the heart of your vein is called the muscular pump. And I have a picture of it from our slides, or from our textbook rather. So I'm going to paste that in here real quick. I'll delete it after I'm done talking about it so it doesn't obscure our view. So what we're looking at here is that we have a vein, and remember that veins have valves. Valves prevent backflow. When our skeletal muscles contract, they get shorter, they push on that vein, and that propels the blood in the forward direction. So think about how you feel physically, your blood kind of pumping more when your body is moving. Yeah, that's called muscular pump. So muscular pump. The next thing that muscular pump also does is increases venous return. So that's the thing that the muscular pump does is increase venous return. Venous return we talked about in our cardiac output video. Venous return is one of those things that increases stroke volume. Increasing stroke volume then increases cardiac output. So that's great. That's an important thing to happen. The next thing to help blood get back to the heart and veins is called the respiratory pump. The respiratory pump is the lungs. We breathe in, we breathe out. When you take a really deep breath, your stomach kind of inflates because your diaphragm collapses a little bit. And then your chest kind of falls because that breath is going into your abdomen just a little bit. As that happens, that's changing the pressures in your thoracic cavity and your abdominal cavity. And then similarly, when you exhale, pressures change in your abdominal cavity and in your thoracic cavity. That pressure change helps veins. It helps pump that blood back to the heart, also increasing venous return. Also increasing venous return. And then the last thing is sympathetic input. And that affects, again, you guessed it, venous return. Activating the SNS encourages venoconstriction. That's a new word. I'm going to write it down. Not vaso, venoconstriction. And because it's a new word, I'm going to highlight it. Venoconstriction is constriction, getting smaller, of just the veins. And venoconstriction, when those veins constrict, makes it so there's less blood in the veins. And when there's less blood in the veins, that blood has to go back to the heart, because where else is it supposed to go? It can't backflow because veins have valves. So all of that increases venous return, increases stroke volume, increases cardiac output. All of these are good things. That is the last part of this video. We are going to jump more into blood pressures in the next one.